We've got two more sessions to do. This one is called Land Use and Community Planning, and it's a short one. We have two presenters. We have Dave Sapsis from CAL FIRE and Tom Cove from the University of Utah. And we're going to start with Dave, who I think a lot of you know, or should know if you don't. He'll be talking about mapping wildland fire threats to people and property and risk communication to regulators, planners, and the public. Dave is a fire scientist with the Fire and Resource Assessment Program in CAL FIRE. He works out of Sacramento. Dave, it's all yours. You have a half an hour. We'll tell you at 25.
Right.
Okay. All righty.
How do I not spill? Good afternoon. I feel I kind of know what Craig feels like. I guess yesterday I realized that I got the lima bean of the slot that is immediately after lunch. And I reflexively said, why didn't I complain to the steering committee? And then I realized I was on the steering committee. It's a medical fact that when you're digesting food, you're not quite as sharp as otherwise. So
you'll be able to get a lot of things over us that we won't know.
Well, I was more like thinking about me, and if it all goes really south, it's human physiology. As far as you guys, I will warn you, I relearned that kind of weird animation utility in PowerPoint. It should keep you awake. Anyway, I'm going to talk, this is going to be an interesting little talk here in the sense that I think there's a little bit of an inflection point in my own career relative to developing data to support fire management. And in particular, trying to understand after 30 years of saying many of the same things, continuing to have to say the same things. In other words, the communication has had some stumbling blocks, and I've looked introspectively a little bit into that and tried to make some sense about why is that, and maybe some good ideas will come out of it. In any event, up here is a picture of a map that we built in 2003 and 2003 was a very, very large active fire year in Southern California. If you can see those red perimeters, there are all kinds of fires, old cedar in San Diego. And at the time, we had developed at FRAP a model of wildland urban interface that defined basically areas of populated landscape and land use that had a approximate fire threat to them, an exposure of wildland fire, if you will, and using GIS data and techniques. And you can see the interface there in different shades of blue. Darker blue represent higher density structures. And in general, the fires don't burn too much into those blue areas. The developed zone largely acts as fire limits to spread, but not wholly. And folks like this map, and then, you know, the next thing you know, you're asked to do another map, and then another map, and then really like another map. And we've done a lot of maps. Here's a map. I don't know which one's this one. Oh, that's fire environments. There's surface fuels. There's fire threat. Here's fire hazard severity zones at the state level. Talk a little bit about what this map is like. That's for SRA, and there's the map for the recommended fire hazard severity zones for the city of Santa Rosa that was released. I'd have to look. I'm going to guess it was about 2008 or so. This map product is quite germane to the regulatory framework for fire safety and structure protection. When a local jurisdiction adopts a very high fire hazard severity zone, they basically turn their landscape into a minimum equivalent of state responsibility areas, such that things like defensible space and building code requirements for WUI protection will apply in local jurisdictions, just like they do throughout the wooded area that is state responsibility areas. But you see there's a whole lot of maps up there, and some of them are different from one another. And They tend to look pretty good when you're looking at them from about the height of a satellite. But when you start to mine down and Google, where did those guys come from with that dang zoom utility? When you zoom in and then you start to see a line on a map and a person can distinguish that they're on the right side of the line and their neighbor's on the left, they call you up. They want to know how that line got there. So maps carry with it a certain degree of expectation and understanding. And I don't believe that we in the science and management community have done the best job that we can communicating the uniqueness of the maps. What were they designed for? What do they say? What are their limitations? And I've become pretty keen on the limitations of the products that we build. All of these maps, again, they're designed to help people manage for fire. But in general, lots of folks think that managing for fire is some sort of unique idea when the map has really a very, very specific application. You know, again, some of them are quite different from one another, but they're still fire maps. So there's this presumption that when they see two different fire maps, there's a lot of questions. They want to know what's going on there. They all have an element of prediction about them. In general, these are strategic kinds of maps to inform management actions for the future. There's some sort of assessment of what the future forebodes. I don't know if it's being called David or if it's just that Yogi Berra is great, but David Ackerley had this quote in his talk this morning, and I have it this afternoon. It's just a good quote. Making predictions is hard, especially about the future. Yeah, that's Yogi. I guess I have another one that's sort of like this that I could have swapped out. It's from Soren Kierkegaard. The world is lived forward, but understood backwards. In any event, again, I'm confessing a little bit of a shortcoming that I'm sensing in my discipline. And that is its capacity to communicate scientific complexity and issues of uncertainty. And so the presumption of this confession was that science and models really fundamentally give everything anyone needs to make rational decisions. And I thought that. I certainly believe it can inform rational decisions, but it isn't in sum everything that you need to get through and make real fundamental changes. Again, at the foundation of this theorem, if you will, is quantitative risk analysis. And I can quantify that risk if I can quantify the probability of an event and its outcome. And even sort of decoupling it or pulling it apart a little bit further, here is another triangle. Those fire people really, really like triangles. This is the fire risk triangle, where you have likelihood, intensity of the event, and the susceptibility of the stuff that you care about that's going to get changed as a function of that intensity of that event. And here you have it almost in just a pure economic or econometric equation. I won't bore you with it, but it basically says E as is expected. Remember, this is a forecast. But the expected net value change for fires 1 to N is the sum of all burn probabilities of fire I times the net value change associated with fire I. This is really easy, right? Everybody's going to understand this, no problem. I guess not. We have models that are built around this, and I've drank the Kool-Aid on these models. I actually do believe in them. They're complicated. There's a lot of components to it. There's a lot of assumptions. There's a requirement for an awful lot of data to describe the physical environment that drives ignitions and spread and fire behavior, and describes all of those assets and natural resources that are impacted by those fires, including structures. And you can roll all of that stuff up and basically come up with a number that says, for this area, here's the expected loss for this particular area related to wildland fire. And maybe you can even do that exact same model run, presuming some change in the management system, whether that's the institution of a policy or a percentage of compliance of defensible space or something. And thereby you could actually tease out the net marginal impacts of alternative policies and really maybe guide through some sort of adaptive monitoring schema, you know, a iterative process where you hone in on an efficient solution. It seems kind of complicated, but actually this stuff is in place, and it's not too dissimilar to at least some of the models and components that were discussed this morning about doing fire simulations, using probabilities, and in inferring impacts to the stuff that we care about. At the national scale, there is the Fire Modeling Institute out of Missoula that's basically developing this kind of a template for assessing wildland fire risks for the national forests. And there are certainly some good components out of this that I think we can improve our modeling from. But again, I'll go back to the confessional element that says that's not going to solve all of our problems. I think we can make great maps, improve our maps, but there's more to the picture. Models really are only so good in that they're trying to predict these future outcomes, but they've got these real wrinkles in them that I think end up being these stumbling blocks with respect to communication. They have uncertainty, stochasticity. It's kind of a complicated word, but it means basically randomness selected from some kind of a known distribution. And probabilities. And probabilities in humans having a real kind of tough time with those. How can you forget about people? I've been trying to communicate about risk and probabilities most of my career, and I feel like I've come up short. So that's the confessional nature of this talk. I do believe that we're making strides in it, but recognize that, you know, models are imperfect, there's uncertainty. Even if I can tell you, well, here, let me give you an example. There's a bunch of people that develop risk probabilities associated with flood. They assigned Houston as a 100-year flood zone. They've had 400-year floods in, I believe, 16 years. So something's a little goofy, right? I think some of that applies to California. There's a lot of uncertainty with our estimates about burn probabilities, and certainly burn probabilities in urbanized landscapes because they're hugely rare. But when they happen, people want to know why. And why didn't you tell me that this was sort of in the realm of possibilities? Well, if there's one take-home message, almost anything is possible. I think that's a quote from Chinatown. Yes, Mr. Geddes, given the right circumstances, anything is possible. So what is it about people, and what really is kind of, what's the uniqueness of the communication element that technology has over on people, or my inability to communicate what technology and science provides to people, to provide them some degree of comfort and understanding and maybe guidance? And when I say people, I am talking about everybody that's listening. Politicians, legislators, managers, executives, the public, local governance, fire managers, really everybody, trying to understand this kind of complicated stochastic system that I had sort of deduced was kind of like a clock. It's really not that complicated. It has uncertainty, but you know, it's not that complicated. Well, I've come across a few things, and I think just humans are unique in the sense that their experiences form their frame of reference. And so when you've lived in a certain kind of place and you've been exposed to a certain kind of environment, and it may have included fire, it may have excluded fire, that's going to really strongly inform your perspective. You know, your average people are usually not experts in fire, but I think ever since Fire and Bambi, fire is really interesting and really, really popular. And folks want to know about it. It's not the kind of topic that doesn't get people's general interest. And when things kind of go a little haywire with respect to fire, people really get interested. And as you know, we've had a day and a half of talks. California and fire is just, you know, it's a place of fire. There's a lot of fire. And this duality or this paradox of trying to manage for wildland fire for ecological objectives while co-managing fire for the human ecology that's interspersed into that fire landscape is, you know, a big challenge. And there's some just intrinsic kinds of conflicts. And resolving those conflicts might be just saying there's a conflict, and sometimes it's going to bite us. There's also been some pretty interesting research just on understanding what constitutes probabilities. In a recent survey of folks, it was shown that there was a significant difference of interpretation between two equivalent probabilities, one expressed as 1/10 of 1% and one is expressed as 1 in 1,000th chance. Those are equivalent probabilities, but for whatever reason, people really did think that a 1/10 of 1% chance was a more likely kind of event. This last little bit I think is a little tricky. It says that there are varying opinions about the government's ability to do the right thing. In other words, to trust the government to provide sound information that really serves the public. And you'll notice that I've asterisked this thing. And I wanna give a shout out to Sarah McCaffrey, who I've spent the last couple of days with chatting about, and I think sort of co-informing our talks today about the role of communication and science and technology. And I will argue here that I think I am making this presumption largely that the public doesn't have trust in what I have to say, and that it has been a shortcoming on my part to not treat all of you people as adults and say, here's what I know about things, and does this make sense to you? And if it doesn't, talk to me and I'll talk back to you. In other words, have a dialogue about why we've built the map the way we have and why it has some limitations, but given the resources and the statutory requirements or whatever objective it was, this was our rationale. And that's, you know, being as transparent as I can about it. So I think that there's a predisposition on the part of some scientists and modelers that don't value the public's opinion in a communication fashion to have a two-way conversation about the work that they've done. That doesn't mean I don't believe that technology and models don't have utility. It's largely what I built my career on. And that I won't continue to try and seek solutions to improve my communication techniques. If any of this makes any sense at all to you, maybe I did okay, but come up and see me. If there's anything about the work that you see coming out of the Fire and Resource Assessment Program, about fire hazard severity zones, about any of the maps and analytics that we do, any of the stuff that's going to recently, we've got a forest and rangeland assessment that will be hitting the streets here. In fact, it is being reviewed as a public document and being presented to the Board of Forestry today or tomorrow here in Santa Rosa concurrently. The Fire and Resource Assessment Program was established legislatively to create these periodic resource assessments. There is a lot of fire analysis in that document. A number of fire-related indicators that have ecological meaning, that have management implications, directions with regard to implementing current policies like fuel treatments for ecological improvement and hazard reduction. All of those things are actively happening now. And so, I think government's doing some really good things, but we need to hear from you. We need to hear what you think of what we're doing. And if we're doing a lousy job, let us know. I want to hear it. I think probably pretty much everybody else does. We are actively going to be remapping fire hazard severity zones. The shoe is now dropping. The old maps came out in the late aughts. It's kind of a two-phase cycle between state responsibility areas and local responsibility areas. We are now statutorily required. The target dates are, these may be a little hopeful, but we hope to have all of this done by the end of next year. it's going to have some improved stuff in it. I don't want to go into the details. I think, you know, we definitely have new modeling techniques, new data. We can really improve on these things. One of the pieces I do want to call out, because it's been talked about a number of times already in the conference, is we're building some downscaled fire climatology because a statute passed through the legislature that says the next time CAL FIRE maps fire hazard severity zones, they need to use localized weather information in them. We kind of knew this the last time. It was a big shortcoming. I think everybody in the morning session that is relying on climate input data to model fire occurrence and impacts into the future recognize that wind is a significant data gap in that. We've been actively working on reconstructions of fire climatology using some numerical downscaling techniques like those that Craig had shown. And they're looking, I'll just briefly show you those, but they're looking really promising. That's one technological development, because honestly, like hot, dry winds are like the magic pixie dust that you sprinkle onto the system that causes urban conflagrations. You don't get Coffee Park kinds of outcomes without extreme hot, dry winds. And it's been repeated historically time and time again back in the past. So here's a picture, hopefully. There's a 10-year Fosberg reconstruction. Fosberg is just an integrated fire weather index. Think of it as hot, dry, windy. 10 years at 2-kilometer grids based off of an hourly reconstruction for the entire annualized year. That 2 percentile represents 73 unique records for each 2-kilometer cell. Hope I can show, is this it, the red thing? In any event, there's sort of a red spot right around Mount St. Helena in that map. I do want to talk about winds. We talked a lot about winds. We're really paying attention to winds and modeling winds. Here is a reconstruction of a 50-year maximum wind speed gust fire return interval across the state based on that 10-year reconstruction. These are rare events. You apply a body of statistics that deals with really rare kinds of events, and we're looking into the process and statistical techniques that you use to do this to improve upon it. And we think we've really come across some substantial improvements. They also allow us to give error terms associated with those estimates. When things don't happen very often, your estimates have larger confidence limits around them. It's just a fundamental of numbers and statistics. Again, landing on where we were in Santa Rosa, will the remapping include areas not previously on the map? You can't fully see, because of the road network on this graphic, the full extent of what we'd made as a recommendation to Santa Rosa. And at least it's my understanding that the city of Santa Rosa had actually, under their own authority, included additional areas in their local adoption of very high zones. But neither of us at the time considered Coffee Park to meet that threshold. Whether that does in these future iterations or not will depend on the modeling, but it's certainly within our ideas. We're really recognizing that, you know, the footprints of where these events can occur have a very significant signature related to these hot, dry, windy events. And we're working on some new stuff. I think John Keeley yesterday made the case that ignition management under extreme fire potential days might be something that we really want to look at. I think it's probably not a big stretch to say, by the time the Butts fire was 20 minutes old, 30 minutes old, and however large it was off and running. And it was going to do a lot of damage until the weather abated. If we could have mitigated the ignition that initiated that fire, it might have had a really significant different outcome. This is just some work that we worked on in conjunction with the California Public Utilities Commission to invoke mitigation measures for power companies to hopefully reduce ignition potential. So that's my talk. I don't know if we've got time for questions or not.
We do have time for 1 or 2 questions. Any questions for Dave?
Are you guys brain dead because of all the food?
Okay, so my question is, the maps that you guys are producing, to what extent does that information or can that information feed into the way that land is used and communities are planned?
That's a really good question. I didn't address it. Fire hazard severity zones end up being through the statute that's requiring us to include local winds. That's SB 1241. That was a Senate bill that required CAL FIRE consultation and local land use planning. And there's a number of the personnel in the land use planning program in the audience, I believe, including Chief Manoa, who runs that program. If you're in those zones, that is the vehicle by which CAL FIRE then engages local land use planning in safety. It is the nexus by which CAL FIRE has intersected itself into that local land use planning process. And the case has been made for a long time that we continue to put people out in high hazard areas. Is that a wise choice? I don't know exactly where all of that will eventually go, but I think it stimulates a good conversation because the motivations that cause build out in the counties sometimes override those concerns related to safety.
Can we take one more question?
What were the mitigation measures that you discussed with the PUC, and what are the chances that they'll be adopted?
Oh, they have been adopted. And in fact, the regulations preceded the map, which was a bit of a cart before the horse. There are things like inspection intervals, increasing the inspection intervals, the distance clearance requirements of vegetation, pole safety requirements, reporting of fire incidents, and sort of a new thing that now requires a comprehensive fire mitigation plan on the part of the large investor-owned utilities, which really dominate the energy market in California. They're now charged with creating these fire mitigation plans that will be under consult by CAL FIRE and the CPUC, and we're going to hold their feet to the fire, if you will, with regard to providing key data that's presumably going to give us insight into how to reduce those emissions.
We can do one more.
I heard that that CAL FIRE had suggested that Fountain Grove shouldn't have been put where it is in terms of the construction when it was first proposed, and that the city council at that time rather ignored that recommendation. And so are those recommendations that may not stand, but you still make them?
There's a lot of blood in my stomach, but I think I'm not going to answer that question. I don't know what happened when Fountain Grove was built out, and I don't know whether it probably might not have even been within city limits. That would have likely had some degree of interaction with the local planning authority and build out with the fire protection system. But I would be really just kind of guessing at the wind as to the veracity of that.
Okay, still need to find out. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dave.